Hello. This 10th and final section of Schopenhauer's The Art of Literature is titled On Genius. Now, genius is not a literary topic per se, but T. Bailey Saunders tells us in his introduction that he includes it for two reasons. First, because Schopenhauer's theory of genius is constant throughout his writings, and he makes regular reference to it. And second, because genius is a quality most necessary for literary success. Wherever we find literary greatness, we're likely to be finding a genius mind at work. The comments here come from the second half of Schopenhauer's essay in Pererga, the title of which begins, Some Thoughts Concerning the Intellect. In this first section, Schopenhauer will describe to us the nature of genius and its contrast with ordinary minds of ordinary quality and activity. And he'll speak about the double aspect of the mind of the genius, the way he has a kind of double intellectual capacity, both in the subjective and in the objective side. He possesses the ability to rise above the demands of will in his own person and in his own life. Schopenhauer gives the example of Goethe as a great literary figure who embodies this type of genius, and then he generalizes his theory to apply to the entire human race on a large scale. So that's what we'll be hearing first. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. No difference of rank, position, or birth is so great as the gulf that separates the countless millions who use their head only in the service of their belly, in other words, look upon it as an instrument of the will, and those very few and rare persons who have the courage to say, no, it is too good for that. My head shall be active only in its own service. It shall try to comprehend the wondrous and varied spectacle of this world, and then reproduce it in some form, whether as art or as literature, that may answer to my character as an individual. These are the truly noble, the real noblesse of the world. The others are serfs and go with the soil, glebe adscripti. Of course, I am here referring to those who have not only the courage, but also the call, and therefore the right, to order the head to quit the service of the will, with a result that proves the sacrifice to have been worth the making. In the case of those to whom all this can only partially apply, the gulf is not so wide. But even though their talent be small, so long as it is real, there will always be a sharp line of demarcation between them and the millions. Footnote. The correct scale for adjusting the hierarchy of intelligences is furnished by the degree in which the mind takes merely individual or approaches universal views of things. The brute recognizes only the individual as such. Its comprehension does not extend beyond the limits of the individual. But man reduces the individual to the general. Herein lies the exercise of his reason, and the higher his intelligence reaches, the nearer do his general ideas approach the point at which they become universal. The works of fine art, poetry, and philosophy produced by a nation are the outcome of the superfluous intellect existing in it. For him who can understand aright, cum grano salis, the relation between the genius and the normal man may perhaps be best expressed as follows. A genius has a double intellect, one for himself and the service of his will, the other for the world, of which he becomes the mirror, in virtue of his purely objective attitude towards it. The work of art or poetry or philosophy produced by the genius is simply the result or quintessence of this contemplative attitude, elaborated according to certain technical rules. The normal man, on the other hand, has only a single intellect, which may be called subjective by contrast with the objective intellect of the genius. However acute this subjective intellect may be, and it exists in very various degrees of perfection, it is never on the same level with the double intellect of the genius. just as the open chest notes of the human voice, however high, are essentially different from the falsetto notes. These, like the two upper octaves of the flute and the harmonics of the violin, are produced by the column of air dividing itself into two vibrating halves, with a node between them, while the open chest notes of the human voice and the lower octave of the flute are produced by the undivided column of air vibrating as a whole. This illustration may help the reader to understand that specific peculiarity of genius which is unmistakably stamped on the works, and even on the physiognomy, of him who is gifted with it. At the same time, it is obvious that a double intellect like this must, as a rule, obstruct the service of the will, and this explains the poor capacity often shown by genius in the conduct of life. And what specially characterizes genius is that it has none of that sobriety of temper which is always to be found in the ordinary simple intellect, be it acute or dull. The brain may be likened to a parasite which is nourished as a part of the human frame without contributing directly to its inner economy. It is securely housed in the topmost story, and there leads a self-sufficient and independent life. In the same way, it may be said that a man endowed with great mental gifts leads, apart from the individual life common to all, a second life, purely of the intellect. He devotes himself to the constant increase, rectification, and extension, not of mere learning, but of real systematic knowledge and insight, and remains untouched by the fate that overtakes him personally, so long as it does not disturb him in his work. It is thus a life which raises a man and sets him above fate and its changes. Always thinking, learning, experimenting, practicing his knowledge, the man soon comes to look upon this second life as the chief mode of existence, and his merely personal life as something subordinate, serving only to advance ends higher than itself. An example of this independent separate existence is furnished by Goethe. During the war in the Champagne, and amid all the bustle of the camp, he made observations for his theory of color, and as soon as the numberless calamities of that war allowed his retiring for a short time to the fortress of Luxembourg, he took up the manuscript of his Farbenlehre. This is an example which we, the salt of the earth, should endeavor to follow, by never letting anything disturb us in the pursuit of our intellectual life, however much the storm of the world may invade and agitate our personal environment, always remembering that we are the sons not of the bondwoman, but of the free. As our emblem and coat of arms, I propose a tree, mightily shaken by the wind, but still bearing its ruddy fruit on every branch, with the motto, Dum convelor mitescunt, or Conquestata sed ferax. That purely intellectual life of the individual has its counterpart in humanity as a whole. For there, too, the real life is the life of the will, both in the empirical and in the transcendental meaning of the word. The purely intellectual life of humanity lies in its effort to increase knowledge by means of the sciences, and its desire to perfect the arts. Both science and art thus advance slowly from one generation to another, and grow with the centuries, every race as it hurries by furnishing its contribution. This intellectual life, like some gift from heaven, hovers over the stir and movement of the world, or it is, as it were, a sweet-scented air developed out of the ferment itself, the real life of mankind, dominated by will, and side by side with the history of nations, the history of philosophy, science, and art, takes its innocent and bloodless way. In this first section, Schopenhauer picks up on a theme that we have seen in his other works, the extraordinary nature of intellectual excellence, the way that it raises a man above the common run of humanity, but also sort of marks him for a certain kind of isolation. Right? There is something in the genius that requires careful observation by us. Here he seems to suggest that the genius has a kind of extra power in his soul. He's capable of rising above will and the demands of will, which are the common run of all of us. He never escapes them, but there's a way in which his intellect is able to reach higher to, we might say, sort of get into the upper atmosphere of this earthbound, will-based existence. And this is part of what is so isolating for him. He's not able to engage with his contemporaries in the same mode as everyone else. This is a theme we'll see through the remainder of this essay hit on repeatedly, the isolation of the genius. But I think there's also a way in which Schopenhauer gives us a portrait of genius, that genius is united across time. Genius calls to genius, I might say, from the high mountains of history, adapting a phrase from Nietzsche. I'll say also, since I've mentioned Nietzsche, you might contrast what is said here about the genius with Nietzsche's thoughts about the overman. I think there are some similarities, but also some very significant differences between these. This being kind of the background material against which Nietzsche is doing some of his thinking and defining of the Übermensch. There's this image that Schopenhauer gives us of the brain as a kind of parasite, sort of riding atop the spinal column, drawing its sustenance and not contributing much of anything to the being. That sounds, I think, very odd to the English ear. We think of parasites as things that you would be better off without. But I think what he's going for here is there's a sense in which the brain, especially the brain of the genius, a high-functioning brain, is a kind of free rider on the body and on the bodily existence, the existence that is dominated by satisfying the demands of will. That is to say, it really doesn't fulfill its evolution. It doesn't fulfill an evolutionary function, right? Is an intellect, is a high intellect, is an intellect that's capable of grasping, of the kind of intellectual greatness and cultural greatness that Schopenhauer is speaking of. Is that kind of intellect really pulling its weight, so to speak? Is that type of brain strictly necessary? And we might say no, that brain is kind of a net calorie consumer relative to what it produces for the good of the actual being. So in a sense, I think here, not so much a parasite as a kind of evolutionary free rider, especially in the genius. This is from the perspective of this sort of purely natural physical being and the demands of that kind of existence. There's a way that it stands above and goes beyond this and answers to a different order of value. And I'd like to conclude my comments on this section by sharing with you something that Saunders has omitted. The first two paragraphs of this essay come from a footnote to section 50 of this essay concerning the intellect of Schopenhauer's, but Saunders stops in the middle of the footnote. So I've gotten my copy of the Del Caro and Janeway translation from Cambridge University Press. This is volume 2 of Peroga and Paralipomena. And I just wanted to share with you the rest of that footnote as translated by them, since I think it's revealing of a theme connected with this essay. So this is not part of Saunders' text of the essay on genius, but it comes from the same source material. I'm adding it here on my own initiative. So they translate the passage that from the beginning of this concludes, whatever a nation has to show in works of fine art, poetry, and philosophy is the dividend of the surplus of intellect which has existed within it. Intellect over and above what's strictly necessary. But the footnote goes on the following page with 2 more paragraphs. Here's what Schopenhauer continues by writing. The great majority of people are constituted in such a way that, according to their entire nature, they can be serious about nothing besides eating, drinking, and reproducing. They will immediately use what the rare and more exalted natures have brought into the world, be it religion, science, or art, as tools for their base purposes, mostly by making it into their mask. The intellect of ordinary people is on a very short tether, namely to its anchor, the will, so that it resembles a short and therefore rapidly swinging pendulum, or an angle of elongation with a short radius vector. This is why they really see nothing in things except just their advantage or disadvantage, but the latter all the more clearly, from which arises a great facility in dealing with it. The intellect of the genius, on the other hand, sees the things themselves, die Dinge selbst, and therein lies his ability. But due to this, his cognition of his own advantage or disadvantage is obscured or even suppressed by things, and it comes to pass that those others often make their way in life much more skillfully than he, One can compare them both to two chess players in a strange house, presented with genuine Chinese chess figures, exceedingly beautiful and artistically carved. One loses because his contemplation of the figures constantly distracts and confuses him. The other, without interest for such things, sees in them merely chess figures and wins. That's the end of the footnote from section 50 of the essay, Some Thoughts Concerning the Intellect in General and in Every Respect. It's chapter 3 of volume 2 of Peroga and Paralipomena from Cambridge University Press, translated Adrian Del Caro and Christopher Janeway. So I thought that was fascinating because there's a lot of great images in there, the fast-swinging pendulum, the contrast between the genius mind and the ordinary mind. But here on the question of utility, right, it's precisely because the genius can see the higher value of things and the common man cannot, that the common man is so much more ruthless and efficient in assessing his own advantage and disadvantage and acting in his own best interests. It's like the chess player who appreciates the fineness of the chess pieces, who therefore doesn't apply himself to the actual activity of winning the game, but sort of has kind of artistic, aesthetic experience that gets in the way. So I like that very much, and I don't know why Saunders omitted it. It's possible that it wasn't in the edition that Saunders was translating. Schopenhauer did add to and revise different versions of Peroga and the different essays in it throughout his lifetime. It's possible Saunders was working from a source text that did not include that footnote. I don't know, but I thought that was quite valuable. In the next section of On Genius, we are going to look at the way in which the intellect of the genius differs not just quantitatively, but also, Schopenhauer says, qualitatively. It's a different type of intellect, it seems, from the intellect of the ordinary man. He's also going to speak of the nature of the kind of knowledge and the kind of wisdom that the genius seeks. The genius will be what I think I will call an ardent generalist. He will study things in themselves, the totality of things with a particular intensity. And we're also going to see Schopenhauer here talk about the way in which the genius is what he is for himself alone, not for others, not out of any kind of philanthropic or altruistic motive. He does what he does for himself alone, in part because there's no possibility that any other person or group of people or all of society could repay him sufficiently for what he suffers and for what he does. So here's what Schopenhauer writes. The difference between the genius and the ordinary man is no doubt a quantitative one, insofar as it is a difference of degree. But I am tempted to regard it also as qualitative, in view of the fact that ordinary minds, notwithstanding individual variation, have a certain tendency to think alike. Thus, on similar occasions, their thoughts at once all take a similar direction and run on the same lines, and this explains why their judgments constantly agree, not, however, because they are based on truth. To such lengths does this go that certain fundamental views obtain amongst mankind at all times, and are always being repeated and brought forward anew, whilst the great minds of all ages are in open or secret opposition to them. A genius is a man in whose mind the world is presented as an object is presented in a mirror. Alternate translation. A genius is a man in whose head the world as representation, die Welt als Vorstellung, has achieved a higher degree of lucidity. But with a degree more of clearness and a greater distinction of outline than is attained by ordinary people. It is from him that humanity may look for most instruction, for the deepest insight into the most important matters is to be acquired not by an observant attention to detail, but by a close study of things as a whole. And if his mind reaches maturity, the instruction he gives will be conveyed now in one form, now in another. Thus genius may be defined as an eminently clear consciousness of things in general, and therefore also of that which is opposed to them, namely one's own self. The world looks upon a man thus endowed and expects to learn something about life and its real nature. But several highly favorable circumstances must combine to produce genius, and this is a very rare event. It happens only now and then, let us say once in a century, that a man is born whose intellect so perceptibly surpasses the normal measure as to amount to that second faculty, which seems to be accidental, as it is out of all relation to the will. He may remain a long time without being recognized or appreciated, stupidity preventing the one and envy the other. But should this once come to pass, mankind will crowd round him and his works in the hope that he may be able to enlighten some of the darkness of their existence or inform them about it. His message is, to some extent, a revelation, and he himself a higher being, even though he may be but a little above the ordinary standard. Like the ordinary man, the genius is what he is chiefly for himself. This is essential to his nature, a fact which can neither be avoided nor altered. What he may be for others remains a matter of chance and of secondary importance. In no case can people receive from his mind more than a reflection, and then only when he joins with them in the attempt to get his thought into their heads, where, however, it is never anything but an exotic plant, stunted and frail. In order to have original, uncommon, and perhaps even immortal thoughts, it is enough to estrange oneself so fully from the world of things for a few moments that the most ordinary objects and events appear quite new and unfamiliar. In this way, their true nature is disclosed. What is here demanded cannot perhaps be said to be difficult. It is not in our power at all, but is just the province of genius. By itself, genius can produce original thoughts just as little as a woman by herself can bear children. Outward circumstances must come to fructify genius, and be, as it were, a father to its progeny. The mind of genius is among other minds what the carbuncle is among precious stones. It sends forth light of its own, while the others reflect only that which they have received. The relation of the genius to the ordinary mind may also be described as that of an ideo-electrical body to one which merely is a conductor of electricity. The mere man of learning who spends his life in teaching what he has learned is not strictly to be called a man of genius, just as ideo-electrical bodies are not conductors. Nay, genius stands to mere learning as the words to the music in a song. A man of learning is a man who has learned a great deal. A man of genius, one from whom we learn something which the genius has learned from nobody. Great minds, of which there is scarcely one in 100 millions, are thus the lighthouses of humanity, and without them mankind would lose itself in the boundless sea of monstrous error and bewilderment. And so the simple man of learning, in the strict sense of the word, the ordinary professor, for instance, looks upon the genius as much as we look upon a hare, which is good to eat after it has been killed and dressed up. So long as it is alive, it is only good to shoot at. In this section, Schopenhauer describes the genius as someone who engages in a close study of things as a whole. And this sounds odd to us, perhaps, because we don't think of the totality of things as being something which one can study closely. But this is precisely what characterizes the philosophical genius that Schopenhauer is talking about here. He has an appreciation for the totality of the world, he's not a specialist in any one narrow silo of the world. So that's the type of genius, what I called the generalist, the ardent generalist earlier. And he studies the things as a whole insofar as they are most directly opposed to their opposite, which is himself. It's the sense of self. And I think here we're thinking of the way in which the genius is the place where humanity becomes closest to rising above and perhaps escaping the gravitational pull of the will. It doesn't ever fully succeed, so there's no way of fully transcending the will. But this is the place in which the intellect the human intellect is able to lose itself most completely, to act and to think most selflessly and most objectively. So to rise above the demands of self and of individual striving, of will sort of acting itself out through me, trying the grasping part of existence. And that's what precisely where the genius intellect is able to, like I said, get into sort of the upper atmosphere, almost out of range, to sort of for a moment do something truly great, something bright and clear. There is a question and answer post on the internet that I've found about the translation of this passage. I'll put the link in the description below. I don't think I'll put it up on screen here and go on about it in some detail, but I think it's worthwhile to take a look at this opposition between the things as a whole and the self. Also in this section, we find that the message of genius in society and culture will be experienced by non-geniuses as a kind of revelation. Revelation, Schopenhauer says, as from a higher being, although maybe a being that's only slightly higher. Right? So it's as though one of the lower orders of angels came to speak to us. But it's that similar kind of comprehension, right? The people are kind of in awe. I think of maybe the minions from the Toy Story movie, like they're looking up at the light. Ooh, right. There's just something transcendent, even in the sort of narrow earthbound sense, about the works, the cultural products, and the intellectual products of the genius. There is this image here as well of the idea that the genius doesn't sort of bring forth his works from within himself any more than a woman can conceive on her own. The genius mind needs circumstances, needs the pressures of life and the events, the sort of the historical events of his own place and time, to impregnate the intellect so that something great can be produced by it. That's a helpful reminder and perhaps an interesting point of contrast, potentially, with Nietzsche's Overman. And finally, this image of the geniuses as the lighthouses of humanity. Right? They sort of allow us to see our way between the distant dark reaches of our own culture, of our own place and time. If nobody were to build them, we would be in darkness forever. We would have no hope. So these sort of rare figures who establish a light in the darkness and fix it in one place for the safety and the reference of all the rest of mankind. That's the role that the culture plays. That's the role that the genius plays in culture, according to Schopenhauer. This third part of the essay, Schopenhauer will talk about the rewards and also the hazards of genius, both the burdens that they bear and also the consolations that they receive, and why it is that genius must always necessarily be unappreciated or even condemned and despised by its contemporaries. And for this reason, the man of genius tends to be unsociable and to be a very unpleasant company. And we can read this, of course, in light of what we know of Schopenhauer's biography, that he is perhaps thinking of himself and his own experiences when he's describing this particular fact about the man of intellectual excellence among the common people, and trying to achieve the recognition that that his work deserves in his own place and time during his lifetime. So here's what Schopenhauer writes. He who wishes to experience gratitude from his contemporaries must adjust his pace to theirs. But great things are never produced in this way. And he who wants to do great things must direct his gaze to posterity, and in firm confidence elaborate his work for coming generations. No doubt the result may be that he will remain quite unknown to his contemporaries, and comparable to a man who, compelled to spend his life upon a lonely island, with great effort sets up a monument there, to transmit to future seafarers the knowledge of his existence. If he thinks it a hard fate, let him console himself with the reflection that the ordinary man who lives for practical aims only often suffers a like fate, without having any compensation to hope for, inasmuch as he may, under favorable conditions, spend a life of material production, earning, buying, building, fertilizing, laying out, founding, establishing, beautifying with daily effort and unflagging zeal, and all the time think that he is working for himself, and yet, in the end, it is his descendants who reap the benefit of it all, and sometimes not even his descendants. It is the same with the man of genius. He too hopes for his reward, and for honor at least, but at last finds that he has worked for posterity alone. Both, to be sure, have inherited a great deal from their ancestors. The compensation I have mentioned as the privilege of genius lies not in what it is to others, but in what it is to itself. What man has, in any real sense, lived more than he whose moments of thought make their echoes heard through the tumult of centuries? Perhaps, after all, it would be the best thing for a genius to attain undisturbed possession of himself by spending his life in enjoying the pleasure of his own thoughts, his own works, and by admitting the world only as the heir of his ample existence. Then the world would find the mark of his existence only after his death, as it finds that of the iconolith. Translator's note: for an illustration of this feeling in poetry, Schopenhauer refers the reader to Byron's Prophecy of Dante. It is not only in the activity of his highest powers that the genius surpasses ordinary people. A man who is unusually well knit, supple, and agile will perform all his movements with exceptional ease, even with comfort, because he takes a direct pleasure in an activity for which he is particularly well equipped, and therefore often exercises it without any object. Further, if he is an acrobat or a dancer, not only does he take leaps which other people cannot execute, but he also betrays rare elasticity and agility in those easier steps which others can also perform, and even in ordinary walking. In the same way, a man of superior mind will not only produce thoughts and works which could never have come from another. It will not be here alone that he will show his greatness, but as knowledge and thought form a mode of activity natural and easy to him, he will also delight himself in them at all times, and so apprehend small matters which are within the range of other minds more easily, quickly, and correctly than they. Thus he will take a direct and lively pleasure in every increase of knowledge, every problem solved, every witty thought, whether of his own or another's. And so his mind will have no further aim than to be constantly active. This will be an inexhaustible spring of delight, and boredom, that spectre which haunts the ordinary man, can never come near him. Then, too, the masterpieces of past and contemporary men of genius exist in their fullness for him alone. If a great product of genius is recommended to the ordinary, simple mind, it will take as much pleasure in it as the victim of gout receives in being invited to a ball. The one goes for the sake of formality, and the other reads the book so as not to be in arrear. For La Bruyère was quite right when he said, "All the wit in the world is lost upon him who has none." The whole range of thought of a man of talent, or of a genius, compared with the thoughts of the common man, is, even when directed to objects essentially the same, like a brilliant oil painting full of life, compared with a mere outline or a weak sketch in watercolor. All this is part of the reward of genius, and compensates him for a lonely existence in a world with which he has nothing in common and no sympathies. But since size is relative, it comes to the same thing whether I say Caius was a great man, or Caius has to live amongst wretchedly small people, for Brobdingnag and Lilliput vary only in the point from which they start. However great, then, however admirable or instructive, a long posterity may think the author of immortal works, during his lifetime he will appear to his contemporaries small, wretched, and insipid in proportion. This is what I mean by saying that as there are 300 degrees from the base of a tower to the summit, so there are exactly 300 from the summit to the base. Great minds thus owe little ones some indulgence, for it is only in virtue of these little minds that they themselves are great. Let us then not be surprised if we find men of genius generally unsociable and repellent. It is not their want of sociability that is to blame. Their path through the world is like that of a man who goes for a walk on a bright summer morning. He gazes with delight on the beauty and freshness of nature, but he has to rely wholly on that for entertainment, for he can find no society but the peasants as they bend over the earth and cultivate the soil. It is often the case that a great mind prefers soliloquy to the dialogue he may have in this world. If he condescends to it, now and then, the hollowness of it may possibly drive him back to his soliloquy, for in forgetfulness of his interlocutor, or caring little whether he understands or not, he talks to him as a child talks to a doll. Modesty in a great mind would, no doubt, be pleasing to the world, but unluckily it is a contradictio in adjecto. It would compel a genius to give the thoughts and opinions, nay, even the method and style of the million preference over his own, to set a higher value upon them, and wide apart as they are, to bring his views into harmony with theirs, or even suppress them altogether, so as to let the others hold the field. In that case, however, he would either produce nothing at all, or else his achievements would be just upon a level with theirs. Great, genuine, and extraordinary work can be done only insofar as its author disregards the method, the thoughts, the opinions of his contemporaries, and quietly works on, in spite of their criticism, on his side despising what they praise. No one becomes great without arrogance of this sort. Should his life and work fall upon a time which cannot recognize and appreciate him, he is at any rate true to himself, like some noble traveler forced to pass the night in a miserable inn. When morning comes, he contentedly goes his way. A poet or a philosopher should have no fault to find with his age, if it only permits him to do his work undisturbed in his own corner, nor with his fate, if the corner granted him allows of his following his vocation without having to think about other people. So what are the rewards and consolations for the life of genius? Well, I think there's at least 4 that Schopenhauer mentions here. The first comes simply in the life of the genius himself. In being the genius, in doing what he does, he finds the value, the source of value within himself. Second, Schopenhauer mentions that the man of genius, like the accomplished acrobat, is able to do simple things well, better and more easily, more fluidly than everybody else. Think of the way in which an acrobat or a dancer might walk or do some very simple sort of physical task. Why? Why does he do it better than everybody else? Well, because he's got this superlative muscular training and skill and bodily presence, so that the dancer, not performing but simply dancing socially, moves very beautifully and gracefully. There's this kind of grace to the life of the intellect that Schopenhauer is suggesting characterizes the person of genius as well. Third, the genius also is capable of enjoying all knowledge, of taking a sort of special, he calls it an endless spring of delight that the genius might take in all forms of knowledge because of the quality of his mind. And then lastly, the genius is capable of appreciating master works, the great works of history, works of Shakespeare, great works of art, literary works, all the more because of his capability of producing the same himself. So those seem to be some of the consolations, some of the rewards of genius. I think most especially that first one, that he simply has his locus of value, including his self-value, within himself, not in the satisfaction of his will, but in what he can produce for posterity, for the benefit of the entire human race, for the excellence that he alone is capable of. What are some of the hazards of the genius? Well, the first, he will remain unknown in his own time. He will experience the ingratitude of his contemporaries. There's a nice image here that people in general are capable only of appreciating what is at their own level, or I might say, thinking of kind of relativity theory, of what is moving at approximately their own speed. Okay, so if the genius is moving at half the speed of light, he's just going to fly by people that they won't notice him at all, people who are moving much more slowly. So it is simply a matter of the frame of reference that people have is going to be so out of scale to what the genius is attempting and producing that only other people at, might say, his same speed, his same speed, half the speed of light, whatever it is, will be capable of even perceiving, much less judging, what he's trying to do. There's also going to be the case that the genius is going to be seen with a certain amount of disdain and even contempt among the people of his own time and culture. This is the very nature of his work, to be misunderstood. And for this reason, he will be isolated, he will be unsociable, he will not be able to enjoy the sort of ordinary social events and friendships that would be the common lot of mankind, and he'll stand out for that reason. People will say, why is Arthur so flinty, so obnoxious? Why did he throw that old lady down the stairs, etc., etc.? It seems to me that the key feature of the genius emphasized in this section is the genius just wants to be left alone. In fact, what does he say back here on slide 33? I think I printed this out. It's a great quotation. Perhaps after all, it would be the best thing for a genius to attain undisturbed possession of himself by spending his life in enjoying the pleasure of his own thoughts, his own works, and admitting the world only as the heir of his ample existence. Lock myself up, and you guys can have what I've produced after I'm gone as my heir, but please, no interaction with the rest of the world unless I have to. Why? Because the only thing really worthy of my attention is the quality of my own thoughts and the brilliance of my own works. So this kind of retreating to his workshop, to his private study, to be alone with his thoughts, which are the only things of sufficient quality for him, seems to be part of this portrait of the flinty, obnoxious, antisocial genius that Schopenhauer is drawing here. In the next part of the essay, Schopenhauer is going to write about the role of leisure in the life of genius and how this is different from the expectations and activities of the common people. He'll also tell us a bit about the role of the genius in culture and how it happens that each genius has a certain type of weakness, a certain weak spot. He's not excellent all around, but necessarily has some kind of weakness relative to his own greatest strength. So here's what Schopenhauer writes. For the brain to be a mere laborer in the service of the belly is indeed the common lot of almost all those who do not live on the work of their hands. And they are far from being discontented with their lot. But it strikes despair into a man of great mind, whose brain power goes beyond the measure necessary for the service of the will, and he prefers, if need be, to live in the narrowest circumstances, so long as they afford him the free use of his time for the development and application of his faculties. In other words, if they give him the leisure which is invaluable to him. It is otherwise with ordinary people, for their leisure has no value in itself, nor is it indeed without its dangers, as these people seem to know. The technical work of our time, which is done to an unprecedented perfection, has, by increasing and multiplying objects of luxury, given the favorites of fortune a choice between more leisure and culture upon the one side, and additional luxury and good living, but with increased activity, upon the other. And, true to their character, they choose the latter, and prefer champagne to freedom. And they are consistent in their choice, for to them every exertion of the mind which does not serve the aims of the will is folly. Intellectual effort for its own sake they call eccentricity. Therefore, persistence in the aims of the will and the belly will be concentricity, and to be sure the will is in the center, the kernel of the world. But in general, it is very seldom that any such alternative is presented. For, as with money, most men have no superfluity, but only just enough for their needs. So with intelligence, they possess just what will suffice for the service of the will, that is, for the carrying on of their business. Having made their fortune, they are content to gape or to indulge in sensual pleasures or childish amusements, cards or dice, or they will talk in the dullest way, or dress up and make obeisance to one another. And how few are those who have even a little superfluity of intellectual power! Like the others, they too make themselves a pleasure, but it is a pleasure of the intellect. Either they will pursue some liberal study which brings them in nothing, or they will practice some art, and in general, they will be capable of taking an objective interest in things, so that it will be possible to converse with them. But with the others, it is better not to enter into any relations at all, for except when they tell the results of their own experience and give an account of their special vocation, or at any rate impart what they have learned from someone else, their conversation will not be worth listening to, and if anything is said to them, they will rarely grasp or understand it aright, and it will in most cases be opposed to their own opinions. Baltasar Gracian describes them very strikingly as men who are not men, hombres que no lo son. And Giordano Bruno says the same thing. What a difference there is in having to do with men compared with those who are only made in their image and likeness. And how wonderfully this passage agrees with that remark in the Chorale. The common people look like men, but I have never seen anything quite like them. If the reader will consider the extent to which these ideas agree in thought and even in expression, and in the wide difference between them in point of date and nationality, he cannot doubt but that they are at one with the facts of life. It was certainly not under the influence of those passages that, about 20 years ago, I tried to get a snuff-box made, the lid of which should have 2 fine chestnuts represented on it, if possible in mosaic, together with a leaf which was to show that they were horse chestnuts. The symbol was meant to keep the thought constantly before my mind. If anyone wishes for entertainment such as will prevent him feeling solitary, even when he is alone, let me recommend the company of dogs, whose moral and intellectual qualities may almost afford delight and gratification. Still, we should always be careful to avoid being unjust. I am often surprised by the cleverness, and now and again by the stupidity, of my dog, and I have similar experiences with mankind. Countless times in indignation at their incapacity, their total lack of discernment, their bestiality, I have been forced to echo the old complaint that folly is the mother and nurse of the human race. Humani generis mater nutrixque profecto stultitia est. But at other times I have been astounded that from such a race there could have gone forth so many arts and sciences, abounding in so much use and beauty, even though it has always been the few that produced them. Yet these arts and sciences have struck root, established and perfected themselves, and the race has, with persistent fidelity, preserved Homer, Plato, Horace, and others for thousands of years, by copying and treasuring their writings, thus saving them from oblivion, in spite of all the evils and atrocities that have happened in the world. Thus the race has proved that it appreciates the value of these things, and at the same time it can form a correct view of special achievements or estimate signs of judgment and intelligence. When this takes place amongst those who belong to the great multitude, it is by a kind of inspiration. Sometimes a correct opinion will be formed by the multitude itself, but this is only when the chorus of praise has grown full and complete. It is then like the sound of untrained voices. Where there are enough of them, it is always harmonious. Those who emerge from the multitude, those who are called men of genius, are merely the lucida intervalla of the whole human race. They achieve what the others could not possibly achieve. Their originality is so great that not only is their divergence from others obvious, but their individuality is expressed with such force that all the men of genius who have ever existed show, every one of them, peculiarities of character and mind, so that the gifts of his works is one which he alone of all men could ever have presented to the world. This is what makes that simile of Ariosto's so true and so justly celebrated. Natura lo fece e puarupe lo stampo. After nature stamps a man of genius, she breaks the die. But there is always a limit to human capacity, and no one can be a great genius without having some decidedly weak side. It may even be some intellectual narrowness. In other words, there will be some faculty in which he is now and then inferior to men of moderate endowments. It will be a faculty which, if strong, might have been an obstacle to the exercise of the qualities in which he excels. What this weak point is, it will always be hard to define with any accuracy, even in a given case. It may be better expressed indirectly. Thus, Plato's weak point is exactly that in which Aristotle is strong, and vice versa. And so, too, Kant is deficient just where Goethe is great. Schopenhauer in this section notes the wide gap between the genius and the common person. This is precisely where this essay began, as edited by Saunders, right? There's no wider gap than the gap between the man of genius and the common run of humanity. And so he notes also that it is, in general, best for the genius to avoid all social and intellectual contact with certain types of people who can only potentially pull him down or interfere with his work. Schopenhauer speaks here also of the geniuses as the unique high points of humanity, the sort of places where it rises to the very clearest and best height that the human intellect is capable of, doing what only they can do. There's a sense in which each genius is a kind of sui generis, like a sort of its own new genus, like an angel. It is able to do one thing that no other human intellect has been able to do. And we might think here these are very rare, generational, once in a century, once every several centuries intellects like Shakespeare, perhaps Goethe, and others. We're talking about the sort of the best that the human race is capable of producing in this world. He says also that every genius has a characteristic weakness, and they have a weakness because they're human, and human capacities are limited. And it's curious, though, because the weakness turns out to be an element of strength. He says that the weakness will be a lesser developed faculty, which, if it had been highly developed, would have gotten in the way of the achievement of the genius's unique talent or unique ability. So this is by way of accounting, I think, for the fact that the genius will be inferior to common men in some respects. He doesn't specify just what they are, but it sounds like part of this is accounting for the fact that the genius is not somebody who is superlative in every respect of humanity, but one who is great in a particular way that may require some other kinds of inferiority. In the next and final part of the essay, Schopenhauer discusses veneration, the way that common people venerate. He thinks this is bad or low, base. Venerate the persons, the places, the objects of genius. And he talks about what I can only really describe as the kind of midwit engagement with and appreciation of genius. You can listen to what's ahead and tell me in the comments below if you agree with that description. And I think he also gives us a portrait at the end of the kind of heroic character of the solitary genius, carrying on for little or no reward, thinking only of posterity, not of himself, not of his contemporaries, but only of the greatness of the work in front of him and of achieving it to pass it on to the human race. So here's how Schopenhauer finishes the essay. Now mankind is fond of venerating something, but its veneration is generally directed to the wrong object, and it remains so directed until posterity comes to set it right. But the educated public is no sooner set right in this than the honor which is due to genius degenerates, just as the honor which the faithful pay to their saints easily passes into a frivolous worship of relics. Thousands of Christians adore the relics of a saint whose life and doctrine are unknown to them, and the religion of thousands of Buddhists lies more in veneration of the holy tooth, or some such object, or the vessel that contains it, or the holy bowl, or the fossil footstep, or the holy tree which Buddha planted, than in the thorough knowledge and faithful practice of his high teaching. Petrarch's house in Arqua, Tasso's supposed prison in Ferrara, Shakespeare's house in Stratford with its chair, Goethe's house in Weimar with its furniture, Kant's old hat, the autographs of great men, these things are gaped at with interest and awe by many who have never read their works. They cannot do anything more than just gape. The intelligent amongst them are moved by the wish to see the objects which the great man habitually had before his eyes, and by a strange illusion these produce the mistaken notion that with the objects they are bringing back the man himself, or that something of him must cling to them. Akin to such people are those who earnestly strive to acquaint themselves with the subject matter of a poet's works, or to unravel the personal circumstances and events in his life which have suggested particular passages. This is as though the audience in a theater were to admire a fine scene and then rush upon the stage to look at the scaffolding that supports it. There are, in our day, enough instances of these critical investigators, and they prove the truth of the saying that mankind is interested not in the form of a work, that is, in its manner of treatment, but in its actual matter. All it cares for is the theme. To read a philosopher's biography instead of studying his thoughts is like neglecting a picture and attending only to the style of its frame, debating whether it is carved well or ill and how much it cost to gild it. This is all very well. However, there is another class of persons whose interest is also directed to material and personal considerations, but they go much further and carry it to a point where it becomes absolutely futile. Because a great man has opened up to them the treasures of his inmost being, and by a supreme effort of his faculties produced works which not only redound to their elevation and enlightenment, but will also benefit their posterity to the 10th and 20th generation, because he has presented mankind with a matchless gift, these varlets think themselves justified in sitting in judgment upon his personal morality, and trying, if they cannot discover here or there, some spot in him which will soothe the pain they feel at the sight of so great a mind, compared with the overwhelming feeling of their own nothingness. This is the real source of all those prolix discussions, carried on in countless books and reviews, on the moral aspect of Goethe's life, and whether he ought not to have married one or other of the girls with whom he fell in love in his young days, whether again, instead of honestly devoting himself to the service of his master, he should not have been a man of the people, a German patriot, worthy of a seat in the Pulskirche, and so on. Such crying ingratitude and malicious detraction prove that these self-constituted judges are as great knaves morally as they are intellectually, which is saying a great deal. A man of talent will strive for money and reputation, but the spring that moves genius to the production of its works is not as easy to name. Wealth is seldom its reward, nor is it reputation or glory. Only a Frenchman could mean that. Glory is such an uncertain thing, and if you look at it closely, of so little value. Besides, it never corresponds to the effort you have made. Responsuro tuo nunquam est par forma labori. The fame you are due will never correspond with your achievements. Nor again is it exactly the pleasure it gives you, for this is almost outweighed by the greatness of the effort. It is rather a peculiar kind of instinct which drives the man of genius to give permanent form to what he sees and feels, without being conscious of any further motive. It works in the main by a necessity similar to that which makes a tree bear its fruit, and no external condition is needed but the ground upon which it is to thrive. On closer examination, it seems as though, in the case of a genius, the will to live, which is the spirit of the human species, were conscious of having, by some rare chance and for a brief period, attained a greater clearness of vision, and were now trying to secure it, or at least the outcome of it, for the whole species, to which the individual genius in his inmost being belongs, so that the light which he sheds about him may pierce the darkness and dullness of ordinary human consciousness, and there produce some good effect. Arising in some such way, this instinct drives the genius to carry his work to completion, without thinking of reward or applause or sympathy, to leave all care for his own personal welfare, to make his life one of industrious solitude, and to strain his faculties to the utmost. He thus comes to think more about posterity than about contemporaries, because while the latter can only lead him astray, posterity forms the majority of the species, and time will gradually bring the discerning few who can appreciate him. Meanwhile, it is with him as with the artist described by Goethe. He has no princely patron to prize his talents, no friend to rejoice with him. Ein Fürst, der die Talente schätzt, ein Freund, der sich mit mir ergötzt, die haben leider mir gefällt. A prince who knew my talents' measure, a friend with whom to share my leisure, regrettably I had them not. His work is, as it were, a sacred object, and the true fruit of his life, and his aim in storing it away for a more discerning posterity will be to make it the property of mankind. An aim like this far surpasses all others, and for it he wears the crown of thorns, which is one day to bloom into a wreath of laurel. All his powers are concentrated in the effort to complete and secure his work, just as the insect, in the last stage of its development, uses its whole strength on behalf of a brood it will never live to see. It puts its eggs in some place of safety, where, as it well knows, the young will one day find life and nourishment, and then dies in confidence. And so genius, it seems, is always misunderstood. There's not going to be a great deal of understanding and sympathy out there for any genius at any point in time. The genius will be misunderstood by the low, who will, maybe characteristic of their minds and their lives, venerate the places and the objects, sort of go and sort of handle them and marvel at, wow, this is the very seat, this is the very chair upon which he sat, right? So like a museum piece. This because this is the way in which they think, right? They think the intellect of the genius must have somehow imbued these objects with a certain kind of sacredness. So they treat them as relics of a saint, for example. And then what I called earlier the midwit appreciation, they don't fall for the sort of these are the holy objects that were near the intellectually great man. Rather, they obsess over the biography, over the little details of the man's work. They write, we might say, kind of small books about great men, speculating about this or that detail of their biography, or whether Goethe should have married this girl or that girl, etc., missing entirely the quality of the ideas, the great sweep of the intellectual project, of the cultural project, of the inheritance that they have given to us. And so they miss the point in, might say, a slightly higher, but still just as comprehensively wrong way. Schopenhauer also tells us here that the true genius will live and work for himself alone, beyond the demands of will in him. So he lives for himself, for what is in him, but not for the will in him. So he's risen above, again, the kind of grasping elements of desire and the satisfaction of desire, even of higher, more intellectual types of desire. And he lives, if for anybody, he lives for posterity, for the generations to come after, who will be able to see, because they're far enough away from it, the true greatness, the height of his greatness and the magnificence of his work. So he lives selflessly, I would say, but not altruistically, not for the benefit of others, except for the distant others, remote others of posterity, but because the appreciation of his achievement will only be evident to people far distant from him in time. That's been mentioned in a previous essay besides. So there's this portrait of the heroic genius, I think, who's pushing onward, who can die contented, knowing that he will be appreciated at some point in the distant future. So that wraps up my commentary and my reading of On Genius by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated and edited by T. Bailey Saunders. That concludes also this entire work, The Art of Literature. I've not yet picked out what I'm going to do next about Schopenhauer. I very much enjoyed talking about Saunders' translations of his essays, and I could do one of those in the future. I have promised people that I would start in on parts, at least, of The World as Will and Representation. I'm working on a project like that. What I may do in the meantime are some biographical essays about Schopenhauer and about different ways in which he's been read by different commentators and different introductions to his work. So you can look for that in the coming weeks. Thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end of this video, all the way to the end of this book. If you have any suggestions for me, I'd appreciate you leaving them in the comments below or on a comment on a post on my wall here on YouTube. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.